This topic is focusing on genetic changes, specifically mutations. Gene mutations refer to a change to the sequence of the DNA bases, adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine, in the segment of DNA that makes up a gene. This in turn causes the mRNA to create the wrong copy during translation. Remember, that's making proteins. When the mRNA and tRNA bond and the amino acids make an incorrect sequence of proteins. Remember, proteins are responsible for our physical traits. There are different types of chromosomal mutations. There are somatic mutations and germ cell mutations. We learned the word somatic before, or autosomal. That refers to our body chromosomes, our 22 pairs of chromosomes that give us our body characteristics, while the germ cell mutations focus on the sex chromosomes, the X and Y, or the X and X. Euploidy refers to having a normal number of chromosomes, while aneuploidy means gaining or losing a single chromosome. There are two specific examples of aneuploidy: monosomy and trisomy. Monosomy refers to losing one and only one of the chromosomes instead of two. Trisomy is gaining one, and so instead of having two chromosomes or one pair, you have three chromosomes. So you're going to see these words a lot as we talk about these genetic disorders. So remember, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. So instead of one pair, we're going to have maybe three chromosomes for trisomy. Or instead of one pair, we're going to have only one, we're going to be missing one. Then we have polyploidy. Polyploidy refers to gaining a complete set. Instead of having 23 pairs, we would have 24 pairs. Then if we look at the specific DNA or mRNA, if we're losing a certain nucleic base, then that would be called deletion. So if you look at the example, we have the codons, ACC, okay, that's one codon, UCA, that's another codon. And remember, this is in mRNA because we can identify that because of the U, uracil. It's not DNA. So if we look at the underlined C, if we delete it, we get rid of it. So everything else moves over. So instead of ACC, UCA, we have ACU, CAC. So everything's kind of moved over. Now, addition means gaining a nucleic base. If we look here, we have ACC, but let's look at the mutation. We added the G, so instead of ACC, we have AGC, and everything else moves over one. So deletion means I lost one nucleic base. Addition means I gained one nucleic base. Now, substitution, just like in sports, if someone substitutes, if you bring in a substitution, you replace a player. So one player sits on the bench while the other one now is on the floor. Well, that's what's happening here. If you look at the mutation for substitution, we have ACC for the normal, but the mutation is AUC. What did I substitute out? I substituted out a C and replaced it with a U. Now that does not belong there. But if you look after the AUC, everything is the same. Nothing got moved over, nothing got scooted to the left or the right. Everything after that U is the same. Now there are more genetic disorders focusing on the different modes of inheritance. Autosomal dominant. This genetic disorder would be found on the dominant allele, while autosomal recessive genetic disorders would be found on the autosomal recessive allele. Chromosomal disorders maybe, as we said, might be too few or too many chromosomes, while the sex-linked disorders would be focusing on the alleles of the X and Y chromosomes of the sex cells. Now let's focus on specific examples. The first one is achondroplasia. Chondro referring to cartilage. Achondroplasia is another name for dwarfism. This is an autosomal, remember this is autosomal referring to the body cells, not the sex cells. This is an autosomal dominant genetic disorder. It affects 1 out of 40,000 people. They have a normal sized torso, which means chest and stomach area, while their arms and legs are shorter. This affects the bones and the cartilage and the growth plates. As you can actually see in the picture of the family, this is going to be dominant. So their children are recessive. So that means the two parents would have been big H, little a. Two people who have achondroplasia can have normal-sized children. Something that we have to be aware that in society, maybe even from people learn this from movies or not being familiar with people who have achondroplasia, we do not want to make fun of them. We do not want to call them names. One of the things I want us to do is have an empathy and a love for all people. The second genetic disorder on this list is albinism. Albinism is sex-linked. It's X-linked, so it's passed on from the X chromosome. Now remember, the X chromosome can be found in the mom or the dad, but if the mom has the X chromosome and the dad gives the Y, basically, the mom's X chromosome had albinism, it would be automatically in the male. So this is basically happening 1 out of every 17,000 people. This is an absence of melanin. Melanin is what gives you a color pigment. So basically, the production of melanin gives you a darker skin color. All people have the same number of melanocytes. A melanocyte, remember, cyte means cell. A melanocyte produces melanin. So people from a Caucasian background or an African American background have the same number of melanocytes, but those of an African American background or an African background produce more melanin in their melanocytes, in their cells. But in this case, it doesn't matter the background. This can also happen in animals in which there's no pigment being produced. Some of the negative effects are that they have skin sensitivity. They can't be out in the sun. Their eyes also don't have a pigment, so they don't have blue eyes, brown eyes. Because there's no pigment there, they have a red eye color, and that's actually because of the blood vessels. You're able to see the blood vessels in the eye, and they also have visual problems. Then we have ALS. ALS is commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease, and this is because it did happen to the famous Yankees baseball player Lou Gehrig. You may be familiar with Stephen Hawking. Both of those men had Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, and this weakens and destroys the nerves that connect to the skeletal muscle, our muscles in our bodies, so the muscles around our bones. So basically, the patients become paralyzed and then ultimately lose respiratory function and die, so they can't breathe. Then we have color blindness. There are different types of color blindness. There is red-green color blindness. I think there's yellow-blue color blindness, and this is also a sex or X-linked genetic disorder. So things start to kind of blend in. Instead of identifying a red-green, you may see more of a merged color like a light brown. Then we have cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is an autosomal recessive trait. Remember, this is the little r, and this is a common genetic disorder among Caucasians. And what Caucasians are going to be of a light skin color, usually from Europe, and this happens in 1 out of every 1,800 people. This is caused by a genetic mutation on the 7th chromosome, on chromosome number 7. This creates a thick mucus in the lungs and digestive system. It makes it very hard to breathe. But here's the problem with cystic fibrosis. Because of the thick mucus in the lungs, bacteria grows in that, and it causes a lot of problems in the lungs as the bacteria grows, and this thick mucus blocks the breathing pathway. Now, the next one we want to focus on is Down syndrome. Down syndrome is known as trisomy 21. Remember, we just said trisomy means we add an extra chromosome. So instead of having 2 chromosomes on the 21st pair, we have 3 chromosomes. And what this does is this actually not only affects the child physically, but also mentally, in which the child really struggles to think on a adult level. The child does have shorter fingers, that's what digits mean, and also the eyes, the face is affected. Now here's a picture of a karyotype of a child with Down syndrome. If you look, 1, 2, 3, the chromosome pairs are labeled. Now let's go all the way down to the 21st chromosome. The 21st chromosome does not have 2 chromosomes. It doesn't have a pair. It has 3. So this is trisomy. This is having 3 chromosomes, okay, instead of 2. Now you can also check at the very end of this karyotype. You can see it has an X and a Y. So this is a male. This little male child has Down syndrome. Now we're going to move into hemophilia. We did talk about hemophilia before, in which hemophilia is the blood clotting disorder. So when you get a scab, that's going to help with blood clotting. The platelets in our blood help the blood to coagulate, to thicken up, and to stop. And this doesn't happen here. This is a sex-linked trait, or X-linked. People with this condition have prolonged bleeding, and it's very hard for the blood to clot. It doesn't have the right proteins. When babies are born, doctors will usually give the child a potassium shot, and potassium helps with blood clotting, and they will check to see if this child may have the genetic disorder. And in the picture there you can see it's going to be a X-linked trait, so it's carried on the X chromosome, not the Y. So it's a sex-linked. The next genetic disorder is Huntington's disease. This is a fatal, which means causes death, a fatal genetic disorder that causes a progressive breakdown of the nerves. But this doesn't happen in the baby. This happens and occurs when the person is between 35 to 45 years old. So this happens later in life. It is a autosomal dominant trait. So as you can see in the picture, the difference in the breakdown of the nervous tissue in the brain. The next one is Marfan syndrome. Marfan syndrome basically affects the body cells, specifically the fingers, toes, arms, and internal organs such as the heart. The fingers, arms, and legs are elongated and look like they're being stretched. This specifically does happen. This specifically is fatal due to the fact that the aorta, which is the large blood vessel that comes off the heart, is also stretched and is defective. So it causes a problem sending the blood from the heart. The next one is polydactyly. Polydactyly, poly means many, so this is more than one finger. You can have maybe the bones in the finger, but basically this would be having extra fingers or toes. This is also autosomal dominant, so it is a dominant trait. Then we have Patos syndrome. Patos syndrome is trisomy 13. So just like we saw with Down syndrome was trisomy 21. Let's find trisomy 13 here. You can see there are 3 chromosomes instead of 2 on the 13th. And basically what we have here are serious eye and brain defects, blood vessel defects as well, and the child may have a cleft palate. A cleft palate is a cut in the lip and the upper roof of the mouth. That's what the palate means. Palate is the roof of the mouth. Okay, maybe you've seen someone with a cleft palate, and sometimes they have to go in and have surgery done to repair the bone and the roof of the mouth. Now, sickle cell anemia, if you look at the picture there, the Normal red blood cells are biconcave. They're circular, but concave means they indent. And so basically a normal blood cell will be indented on both sides. That's why it looks like there's these little tiny O's in the center. It's because it's indented on the left and right side, but it's circular. But sickle cell anemia actually has the red blood cells deformed in a shape of a moon or a crescent. If you ever heard what a sickle was, what a sickle is what they may have used to cut down hay or grain. It's usually what if you during Halloween or if you watch movies and like Death is carrying around a sickle. So it looks like that sickle shape. This is a genetic disorder that is common among those who have African descent, and it is a autosomal recessive disorder. Now, this is specifically substitution. We talked about what substitution was on the DNA and RNA. Now, is there really an advantage? Not really, but people who have sickle cell anemia have a less likely chance of getting malaria. Okay, so some people may say that might be an advantage in which you don't get malaria, but the disadvantage is because the red blood cell absorbs oxygen and carries oxygen to the cells, these sickle cells cannot do that properly, cannot do that. So they have difficulty breathing, they have difficulty getting energy because these cells cannot transfer oxygen. Then we have Edwards syndrome. Edwards syndrome is also a type of trisomy, but it's on the 18th chromosome. And Edwards syndrome ears, a smaller jaw, and many little babies who are born with Edwards syndrome do not survive. Now, cry-do-chat is something new that we haven't really talked about, but what you can see here is this isn't deletion of a nucleic base. This is actually deletion of a part of the chromosome. So you're missing a whole section of the chromosome. All that information that was on the gene is now gone. The child many times is born with a smaller body part, specifically a smaller head, and it is causes a severe mental complication. Then we move into our last ones, which is the super male and super female. The super female is also adding a chromosome. It's a trisomy, but it's on the X chromosome. It's on the X chromosome, and the focus here, it's called trisomy X. The females here can be taller than average. It does cause a learning disability, weaker muscle tone, and a interesting physical characteristic is that the pinky finger is usually curved. Now, the super male, however, which is called Jacobs syndrome, has an extra Y chromosome. So instead of the super female having 3 X's, here we have 1 X but 2 Ys. And the problem here is that this genetic disorder causes emotional and behavioral issues. The child may be taller than normal, but it does create learning disabilities, weak muscle tone, attention difficulties with behavioral issues. Now, looking at all these genetic disorders, there's so many more than what I listed. These are some of the most common. But as we think about genetic disorders, some of them you can live with, such as polydactyly. The large majority, almost all genetic mutations are harmful. They are not creating X-Men. They're not giving you superpowers. They are going to either kill you, hurt you, affect your physical or mental health. We talked about what a karyotype is, so you will need to be able to identify and now read a karyotype, identifying the pairs, especially if I talk about monosomy or trisomy. We did talk about pedigrees, and we're going to have to use and know how to read a pedigree using these genetic disorders, or by identifying these genetic disorders passed on through family members.